As a Christian, it can be sometimes hard to fight the inner fleshly desires that we have as human beings and sinful people. And it's often battling with our desires and our striving towards being more like Jesus and sanctification and being more like Him. So I thought today we'd look at some Bible verses that talk about sin and how to fight it. Because as a believer, everybody faces sin, even those who are non believers. But as believers, we should be striving not to be in sin. Hey guys, my name's Joshua. Welcome back to More Than Just Faith, the channel to help you grow in more faith and in relationship with God. I thought we'd start in 1 Corinthians, actually. 1 Corinthians 6:18 is our first verse that I thought we'd take a look at. 1 Corinthians 6:8 says, "Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body." And already we see this idea of that as believers we should be fleeing from sin, from sexual sin specifically. But in general, this is a good idea that we should follow for most sin. Now, the Bible doesn't say specifically about specifically other sin. It talks specifically about sexual immorality in this passage, but it is definitely a good idea or moral we should apply to other types of sins as well. And so I thought we'd take a look at the first word, which is flee, and look specifically at its Greek origins. The Greek word is phoiget. I'm not a Greek historian or fluent in that, so please forgive me if my pronunciation is not correct. But essentially, it is meaning to flee, to shun or avoid by flight, something abhorrent, which in this case, the abhorrent thing, the thing that we should not like whatsoever, is the sexual immorality in the passage. And it's cool. It's interesting because it says not to fight it, because a lot of Christians or people who give advice will say, you just got to fight the sin. Well, the Bible tells us we're not supposed to fight the sin. We're supposed to flee it. It's very easy for us to get tempted when we get exposed to things that will make it very easy for us to become susceptible to those things. Fleeing means that you should avoid it by making steps beforehand to avoid the sin. This ultimately comes from walking with the Spirit and trusting in the guidance of the Spirit, because after all, the Holy Spirit is our helper. That's what God has given us as believers, helps us fight our inner fleshly desires and turn to God and righteousness and walk along that path of sanctification. And this is why, because it's primarily fleeing from sin is not a reactive thing. It is a proactive thing. It happens before. This reminds me of a song by Casting Crowns that released at least more than 10 years ago called Slow Fade. And the whole premise of this song is it takes one extra second, one little thing, and then more, you want more, and then you want more, and then everything starts falling apart. And that's just the core idea of this song. It's a really good song. You guys should listen to it. I'll leave it in the description for you guys to find it. Now, the second passage I want us to look at is James 1:14 through 15. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after each desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's fully grown, gives birth to death. See, sin comes to us when we let our guard down. It can happen anywhere, but each person is tempted when they're dragged away by their evil desire and enticed. Once that evil desire grabs hold of them, it just drags them away. We got to prevent that. That's why we have to be proactive in preventing. We're fleeing from it. This is why we have the armor of God, guys. The armor of God essentially represents the defense and the things we have to do to prevent our defenses against the attacks of Satan in our spiritual lives. And that comes from fleeing from sin and seeing what sin is beforehand and listening to the Spirit and preventing it, striving to do beforehand to prevent it. This is just like in the military. In the military, you have what's called a preemptive strike, which is a military operation to prevent an enemy's ability to attack you. Likewise, as Christians, we should have a preemptive strike against Satan to limit his ability to attack you. Now, for example, as a little kid, as most little kids would, I really loved candy. This was probably around when I was 14, 15, so maybe not that little, but I really loved candy and I wanted to eat more of it. I wanted to eat more of it. Now, the thing is, I knew at that time that candy, eating too much of it, was not good for me. And I said to myself, I need to stop eating it. But nothing happened. I kept eating it and eating it and more. You're probably wondering where I'm going with this, but eventually came to one day that I decided to take the initiative, and I ended up moving my bag of candy that had been in the open right in the middle of the kitchen on the counter that I could see every time I walked in the kitchen. I moved it up inside the closed doors of our pantry, and suddenly the desire to have it kind of disappeared because I wasn't seeing it every day. I wasn't thinking about it as soon as I walked into the kitchen. And you might think this example is very rudimentary, but I made it quite simple, you guys, for understand. The proactiveness, now, I it took me a while to do it, but the proactiveness of striving to put it away from my life caused me to think less about it, and ultimately, I don't eat candy that much nowadays. And I can do without it. I do have some candy every once in a while, but it's not an essential part of my life. And now, the final passage is a bit longer than I want us to look at, so I ended up pulling out my Bible, and I recommend you guys pull it out, and I'd like you guys to pull out to 2 Samuel 11, and I'm going to read through some of it, and then I'll break down some of what is said. This is 2 Samuel 11:1. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. Now we see a problem already rising. King David, he's the king. He has the duty as the man to lead the army. And here he is just resting at home in Jerusalem. That's number one problem. Then going on in verse 2, one evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David, "I am pregnant." And now most of you knows where the story's going. David eventually starts conspiring with people to get the husband of Bathsheba to be killed, and eventually in the end he was killed, and then David ended up marrying Bathsheba. But then afterwards David's reign sort of fell apart. And so if you'll notice there, that all it took was David looking 1 second too long at Bathsheba for everything for the past few years he's been working as a king. He's about in his 50s right now. Everything from then on he'd been working since he was a king fell apart in an instant of a second. The instant of the second when he stared 1 second too long at Bathsheba. There's the difference. David couldn't. It didn't happen. Could have looked 1 second at her and turned away and realized, I am lusting after her. But no, David stared, and then he stared, and then it became a glare, and then suddenly he's just staring at this young woman. We notice that eventually, throughout the entire story, David eventually broke all 5 of the commandments about loving his neighbor. We notice the first step is he's breaking the 10th commandment. He starts coveting after his neighbor's wife. That leads to the 7th commandment that he breaks, which is committing adultery. And then he breaks the 6th commandment, where he murders him. And before he murders him, he breaks the 8th and the 9th commandment. He stole, the man's wife. He bore false witness against Uriah by trying to trick him several times to get him to, because he was concerned that Uriah was going to find out that his wife was pregnant. And so he tried to make up tricks to make Uriah think that he had got Bathsheba pregnant. And eventually this brought him to break the fifth commandment, which is when he dishonored his family and his parents and brought shame and dishonor upon them. And all of this stemmed from staring 1 second too long at them. And so my final message for you guys watching the video is be proactive in fighting sin. Jesus said to pull out the eye rather to continue this in sin in Matthew 5. If you find that you start watching lustful photos on your phone, do the hard thing and get rid of your phone, or find a software that blocks these things that you're lusting at and you want to look at from seeing on your phone. If you know you're maybe susceptible to having sensual and maybe erotic, lustful hugging with people or touching people, don't hug or touch them anymore. My whole point is that you need to think more proactively about what you're going to do to prevent more sin happening in your life. Of course, this is not going to come naturally for you. We're all sinners, and it doesn't come naturally to me either. I have to rely on the Holy Spirit on thinking about what I did beforehand. And so, my final message for you guys is be proactive, rely on the Holy Spirit, rather lose the eye than your whole body. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you liked the video. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.